February 1945. Iwo Jima. The volcanic ash hung thick in the air. The ground trembled beneath the weight of naval bombardment. Somewhere beyond the blackened ridges of Mount Suribachi, the Pacific Ocean churned grey and restless under winter clouds. In the makeshift field hospital 300 meters behind the American front lines, Navy corpsmen moved with surgical precision through rows of wounded Marines. The air smelled of sulfur, blood, and antiseptic. And in the corner of that blood-soaked tent, half hidden behind a canvas partition, stood Lieutenant Fumiko Takahashi and 3 other Japanese nurses, prisoners now captured during the fall of Saipan 6 months prior, watching something they had been told could never exist. An American soldier lay on a stretcher, his leg shattered below the knee. Within 4 minutes of his arrival, a surgeon had assessed him. Within 7, plasma flowed into his veins. Within 12, he was being prepared for morphine and evacuation to a hospital ship offshore. The speed was inhuman, the resources incomprehensible. One of the Japanese nurses, a young woman named Keiko, leaned toward Fumiko and whispered in a voice barely audible above the chaos, "They treat him like he is their only son." Fumiko said nothing, but her hands, clasped tightly at her waist, trembled. For years the nurses had been told a singular truth by the Kempeitai, by their officers, by the propaganda broadcasts that echoed through the barracks at night, that American soldiers were expendable, that democracy made men weak, that a nation built on individualism could never cultivate the collective will necessary to endure modern war. The logic seemed sound. Japan had been taught that discipline, sacrifice, and the willingness to die for the emperor were the ultimate expressions of military strength. America, by contrast, was a nation of soft merchants and Hollywood dreamers, a people who valued comfort over duty. But here, on this island of black sand and entrenched death, the nurses saw something that shattered that narrative like porcelain against stone. The American military medical system in the Pacific Theater was not an accident. It was architecture. It was ideology made tangible. By 1945, the United States had constructed a logistical miracle that spanned 7,000 miles of ocean, from the beaches of contested islands to fully staffed hospital ships, to rear echelon facilities in Hawaii and the mainland. The system moved with a mechanical grace that seemed impossible to those who had known only scarcity. Consider the numbers. In the Imperial Japanese Army, the casualty survival rate for soldiers wounded in combat hovered near 40%. In the United States Marine Corps and Army, it exceeded 90%. This was not the result of softer combat. Iwo Jima alone would claim nearly 7,000 American lives in 36 days. It was the result of a philosophy that refused to accept death as inevitable. Every American infantry company had a corpsman attached. Every battalion had a surgical team within shouting distance. Every division had access to whole blood flown in from the States, kept cold in portable refrigerators powered by gasoline generators. Penicillin, still experimental in 1943, was being mass-produced and distributed to frontline medics by 1944. Plasma, morphine, sulfur powder, these were not luxuries. They were standard issue. Fumiko had spent 3 years working in a field hospital on Saipan. She knew what scarcity looked like. She had seen soldiers die from infections that could have been cured with basic antibiotics. She had watched doctors ration anesthesia, choosing which men would receive it and which would endure amputation while biting down on leather straps. She had held the hands of boys 17, 18 years old as they shivered through their final hours, their wounds untreated because there were simply not enough bandages, not enough morphine, not enough hands. And now she stood in an American field hospital, watching a wounded Marine receive more medical attention in 10 minutes than some Japanese soldiers received in 10 days. There was a phrase the American medics used. Fumiko had heard it repeated 12 times that first day. Golden hour. It referred to the critical window of time following a traumatic injury, the 60 minutes during which intervention could mean the difference between survival and death. The Americans had built their entire system around collapsing that window. Helicopters, rare, expensive, still experimental, were being deployed to extract the critically wounded from battlefields in minutes. On Iwo Jima, where helicopters couldn't land, Amtraks and Weasels carried stretchers down to the beaches where landing craft ferried the wounded to hospital ships anchored offshore. Keiko, the youngest of the Japanese nurses, had asked Fumiko a question on their third day in the American hospital. Her voice was small, confused. Why do they try so hard? The man with the stomach wound, he will not fight again. He will go home. Why do they spend so much to save him? Fumiko had no answer. The question lingered. In the Imperial Japanese Army, a soldier's value was measured by his ability to serve the emperor. A man too wounded to fight was a man who had fulfilled his duty and could die with honor. Resources were finite. To pour them into the irreparably wounded was to betray those who could still fight. This was not cruelty, it was logic, it was mathematics. But the Americans defied that logic. They spent fortunes saving men who would never return to combat. They evacuated the wounded with the same urgency they brought to ammunition resupply. They treated every soldier as if his survival mattered not just to the war effort, but to something deeper, something Fumiko could not yet name. One afternoon, Fumiko was asked to assist with a triage case. The man was a Marine corporal, 22 years, old, struck by shrapnel across his back and shoulder. He was conscious, lucid, and in extraordinary pain. As Fumiko cleaned the wound site, preparing it for the surgeon, the corporal turned his head slightly and met her eyes. For a moment, she expected hatred. She had seen that look before on Saipan, on Tinian, in the eyes of American prisoners who spat at her and cursed her in a language she barely understood. But this man did not hate her. He simply asked, through gritted teeth, "Where are you from?" Fumiko hesitated. "Hokkaido," she said quietly. He nodded, as if this were ordinary conversation. "Cold up there, right?" "Yes, very cold." A Navy corpsman arrived with plasma. The Marine closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. "Hope you get to go back someday," he said. Fumiko's hands froze. She stared at the corpsman, then back at the Marine, trying to understand. This man, this enemy, had just wished her a future. He had acknowledged her as something more than a uniform, more than a prisoner, more than an abstraction of the enemy. He had seen her as human. That night, Fumiko lay awake on her cot in the guarded tent, where the Japanese nurses slept. She thought of the boys she had treated on Saipan, the ones who had died whispering prayers to the emperor. She thought of the propaganda films she had watched in training, the ones that showed American soldiers as savage, godless, mechanized killers. And she thought of the Marine corporal who had asked where she was from. The dissonance was unbearable. By March, the Japanese nurses had become integrated into the daily rhythms of the field hospital. They were not trusted, not entirely, but they were useful. Fumiko's English improved. She learned the American medics' slang, their abbreviations, their gallows humor. She learned that the tall, blonde corpsman from Nebraska carried a photograph of his daughter in his helmet liner. She learned that the surgeon, a man named Captain Reeves, had been a small-town doctor in Oregon before the war and planned to return to it when the fighting ended. She learned that the Americans sang sometimes, late at night, when the shelling paused and the exhaustion became too heavy to bear. But more than anything, she learned that the American system was not an anomaly. It was a reflection. The Americans did not save their wounded because it was efficient. They saved them because the very idea of abandoning a man, any man, was unthinkable. It was antithetical to everything their society claimed to value. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These were not just words on a document, they were operational principles. One evening, Fumiko overheard two Marines talking near the supply tent. One was freshly bandaged, his arm in a sling. The other was preparing to rotate back to the front. The wounded Marine said something that Fumiko would remember for the rest of her life. "They'll get me home, man. I know they will. They don't leave anybody behind." It was not bravado. It was certainty. It was faith. Fumiko realized in that moment that she had spent her entire adult life inside a system that saw soldiers as tools, valuable, yes, but ultimately expendable in service of a greater whole. The Americans had built a system that saw soldiers as irreplaceable. Every name mattered, every life had weight. This was not weakness, this was the source of their strength. The battle for Iwo Jima ended in late March. By then, nearly 7,000 Americans had died and 20,000 more had been wounded. The Japanese garrison of 21,000 had fought almost to the last man. Fumiko and the other nurses were transferred to a POW facility in Guam, where they would remain until the war's end. But Fumiko carried something with her from that island of volcanic ash and blood-soaked sand. She carried the image of the golden hour, the plasma bags hanging like translucent fruit from metal stands, the helicopters descending through smoke to retrieve the shattered. She carried the voice of the Marine corporal asking where she was from. She carried the weight of a question that had no answer in the world she had been born into. Why do they try so hard? Years later, after the war, Fumiko would return to Japan and work in a civilian hospital in Tokyo. She would marry a schoolteacher, she would raise 2 daughters, and sometimes, late at night, when sleep would not come, she would think of Iwo Jima. She would think of the American field hospital and the impossible speed with which the medics moved. She would think of the corpsman from Nebraska and the surgeon from Oregon. She would think of a system built not on the assumption of sacrifice, but on the refusal to accept unnecessary death. And she would understand, finally, what she had witnessed. She had seen a nation that valued the individual not as a contradiction to collective strength, but as its very foundation. She had seen democracy made flesh in the form of plasma and penicillin, in the roar of evacuation helicopters, in the hands of medics who worked without rest to save men they barely knew. She had seen a truth that no propaganda film could erase, that a society which treats its soldiers as irreplaceable will fight harder, endure longer, and ultimately prevail over one that treats them as expendable. The Americans did not win because they were willing to die. They won because they were determined to live. And in a tent on a blackened island, a Japanese nurse named Fumiko Takahashi had whispered in awe, watching them prove it.